Welcome back, I'm Bill. Today I have with me an American Gas Machines Model 288 lantern. These were made approximately 1928 to 1932, roughly. I've found the patent application, which is dated 1929, so that fits within that window on the early side. There's also a sister model, the 287, which is exactly the same but has the narrow vent, and that seems to be the convention with AGM lanterns from that time period. The ones ending in 7 have the narrow vent, the ones ending in 8 have the wide brim vent. This was AGM's first, I don't know what their term was for it, and I haven't been able to find it, but Coleman's term for it was instant light. This was their first model lantern that you could light without having to preheat the generator. And from what I've told, I haven't fired this one up yet because it has some issues, but from what I'm told, they start up and run extremely well. The technology that's in here actually goes back a number of years. So we can sort of trace these back to we could call it the grandfather was the 257, 258 series lanterns, which would be more like a Coleman quick light. They required preheating, but then AGM introduced their Ready Light technology. And at first I thought Ready Light was their equivalent to Coleman's Instant Light, but that's actually not the case. The Ready Light technology actually referred to the burner assembly up under the vent here. And they came up with a way to better mix the fuel and air so that it didn't flood and so that it lit more easily and ran better. You still had to preheat, but that carried over into the 267 and 268, which again would be sort of like a Coleman quick light, like a 327. They required preheating, and then from there, and they look very much like this. There's very little difference in appearance, the same vents, the same basic design. Then they went to the 277 and 278, which again were identical, but like a 427, going from a Coleman 327 to a Coleman 427. The 277 and 278 series had a built-in pump. In fact, they stick out quite a ways. And then they went from that to the 287 and 288, which we've got here. And most everything stayed the same, but they kept that Ready Light technology, but in this case they also added the instant lighting or no preheat technology, and that's all tied up in this valve here. They call it a carburetor valve. I don't know why no one else uses that term. A carburetor simply is a device that controls and mixes fuel and air ratios, usually for an engine, but I guess you can do it for a lantern. Coleman's Instant Light feature and Akron's Instaglow do exactly the same thing, more or less the same way. But there is a difference in how they designed this lantern. Some of it makes great sense to me, some of it bewilders me. But we'll get into that. So, I have already broken this lantern down. I bought it when I was down at the International Coleman Collectors Club, or convention rather. And my wife and I were doing some camping, and I bought a couple lanterns while I was down there that I was hoping to use while we were camping. And so I did a little bit of cleanup on this and thought I had everything working right. I gassed it up, pumped it up, and it turns out it's got a cluster of pinholes up here, which was kind of a bummer. I was excited to find this because it's the steel painted Fount version. AGM brass founts are notorious for stress cracking. In fact, if you look at my Caswell tank sealer video, that's what I was working on, was a brass Fount AGM lantern. These did come in nickel-plated brass, but they also came in painted steel, so I was happy to find one that was steel. It has no stress cracks, but it does have a cluster of pinholes up here. It's bizarre. At first I wondered, how do you get pinholes in the top of the Fount, especially when there's no damage on the outside? I think at some point this lantern may have fallen off a shelf and landed upside down, and either it had water in it, or more likely it had fuel that was fouled with water, and the whole thing just sat upside down like this because it's only rusty right around here. The rest of the Fount looks pretty nice. So this will involve a few extra steps. I will need to break out the Caswell sealant, and we're going to have to make sure the Fount is all prepped and ready for that. I am going to strip the Fount and repaint it because of that. I want to be able to see what's underneath here. So anyways, I think that's it. So it's time to tear into this. So let me get you repositioned and we will get going on that. All right. I'm not sure this is the original ball nut for this because it seems to be threaded differently than this rod. We may be able to fix that later. It doesn't go down all the way. So we'll take our vent off. Like Coleman and Akron, it's white underneath for the wide brim, which helps reflect all of the light out. We've got a really nice original mica chimney here. All of the mica's in good shape. These were brass, which is kind of neat. I think this will clean up really well. And let's get the generator out. This is not the original generator. AGM had a very similar generator. I'm not sure what the model of it would have been called. This is, I believe, a Coleman R55, just from the placement of the cleaning lever. AGM's were virtually identical, but the cleaning lever was set considerably higher. But they are functionally the same. Now, if you are watching this as an instructional video, not just for fun, we need to stop at this point. So I will just set the generator aside. When I got this, I did exactly what I've just done here. And as I was doing that, I noticed that all of this stuff up here was very wobbly. And that was concerning and weird, and I was trying to figure out how that was the case. You probably won't find that because yours probably hasn't been taken apart the way this was. But these two screws here, one on either side, along with the burner caps, were just kicking around loose inside the globe. And I thought that was kind of weird, but somebody had tinkered with it or something. So since everything was so loose, I decided to be very, very careful. And it's a good thing I did that. I undid this nut and slid the cage up and was able to look down inside the collar and realize this is unlike any lantern design I have ever seen before. And I'm actually a little bit bewildered. When everything is put together like this, when this nut is on and these two screws are in place, everything's nice and solid. But if those aren't, or if you take this apart in the wrong order and you start taking these things off and then go to unscrew the manifold and the air tube, you will destroy the fuel system on this. And so I will show you. So take the generator off. At this point, you need to leave this nut on and you need to leave these two screws in. And then one thing you'll see here, there's a little nub here. And you also want to make sure that that is projecting up through this hole because that will keep what's underneath from spinning. So once that's confirmed, then we can just unscrew this. And it's sort of like a Coleman 220 or the later AGMs in this regard, although there's no screw down below to lock this in place. So before we go any further, let's have a look at this guy. There is a screw back here. And that screw goes through a hole in the tube to keep it from turning. This is doing a perfectly good job of not turning on its own. I've actually heated and quenched this. I had penetrating oil on it, and I've heated and quenched about 8 times, and it still doesn't want to loosen up. So I'm not going to take these two things apart. Our burner caps unscrew, and this one, the little coupler is loose, but there's a little coupler that screws into the manifold and then screws into our burner cap, and you can see the screens are in there. They actually, I think, come out pretty easily. On this other side, the little coupler is definitely stuck in there, and I don't have any good reason that it needs to come out. And I tried to wrench a little bit, did a little heating and quenching. It still doesn't want to come out, and I don't want to trash the thread, so I'm just going to leave that as it is. Now, this is our ready light manifold. And it's kind of interesting. There is an outer housing on top. It's just a cylindrical enclosure. And then inside is this brass tube, and it unscrews as well. Now, these didn't come out as easily initially. From all the heating and quenching I did, the stuff all broke loose. So we've got our holes for the burner caps, and this hole here is where the generator fits in, and it comes up through here, and this guy screws directly in above that. So what's happening with this Ready Light design, you've got your air feed coming up here, because of course for combustion you need fuel and air. So this draws air in the bottom. It comes in through the collar, up through this little hole, up this tube, and into this chamber, while the fuel is shot up from the generator through this tube, and they mix up inside here before being fed back down, and from there just the pressure is going to feed it back down to the burner caps. So my understanding is they designed it this way so that there's more thorough mixing of the oxygen and the gasoline, so better burning, which may be why these things are known to be such good burners. So again, this, I haven't been able to get it apart. I don't want to trash the nickel plating, so I'm just going to leave that the way it is. Now, on to the rest of this. I should say this did not unscrew as easily for me the first time as it did just now. Again, I already had this apart once trying to get it running when I was camping using minimal tools, which wasn't much fun. And then again, I tore everything apart just because I wanted to do an instructional video for you all. This is such a weird design, I wanted to make sure I understood how everything was working before I showed you. So, one thing that may happen when you're unscrewing this guy, and this did not want to come out of this hole down here. So I did some heating with propane a couple of times. I squirted some penetrating oil around the threads here and let it sit. And of course that penetrating oil did penetrate, but it also went down to what, for lack of a better term, I'll call the bung in the top of the fount. So when I eventually did unscrew this, or started turning, instead of this thread turning, the thread below that goes into the bung unscrewed. So I ended up with this whole assembly unscrewing and coming off. If that happens to you, that's okay. As long as this nut is on and these two screws, it's okay. If those are off, what's underneath here is going to break. So this is ideally how it should come apart, but you may have to take it apart from the underside. We'll just take it apart the correct way here though, and then I'll show you what's underneath. So that's that nut, and I don't know if this will be, well, it's not too loose, so that's actually not bad. But now we'll take these screws out. There's a feed system under here. It is one piece, sort of, but it's got a fine brass tube in between that will break. So these two screws lock the burner cage to the bottom portion and to the fount, and that nut that goes on here locks this guy to the upper portion. So with those on, everything is stable and okay. When you take them off, not so much. So there's our burner cage. We'll take our collar off. And this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen on a lantern. So it screws into the top of the fount here, and it's got a support that comes out on the sides, and this is where those screws go in. So this burner cage is secured firmly to this guy, which is secured firmly to the fount, which is also supported by the collar so that it can't rock around. Then you've got this brass tube that curls around here, and it's attached to this guy. and this is the feed for the generator, and it's got the threads or the mounting point for the air tube. So you can imagine, without these screws in here, if you started twisting on the air tube, you're just going to snap this whole thing right off. Now, there is at least one other version of this, and it's actually got it's attached. There's a little column instead of this brass tube, because the fuel comes up from the fount here, comes up through this brass tube, and then feeds into the generator here. There is another version where instead of this brass tube, there's a little pillar in here, a little tube that connects the two together. It looks like it might be a bit more solid than this design, but I don't know that it really is that much more solid. So this guy now just unscrews, and I only really had it finger tight from when I put it back together. So I'm not sure what the best way to get that out is, because you can't really put a wrench on it with this tube here. So when I put it back together, I assembled everything on the burner cage first, and that actually may be your best bet, is while this is still firmly attached to the burner cage, to then use the cage as leverage to twist the whole thing off. As you saw even here, when it was only finger tight and I turned it, I actually did nudge this a bit, and it bent just ever so slightly, not enough to be a problem. But this is our fuel supply. It's weird, but fuel comes out through this nipple, goes up into this guy, through this brass tube, and then up here through the generator. So that's that. And when you're working with this, be careful with it. Even if it's not the one with the tube, if it's got the connecting tube inside there, be careful with it, because I've seen lots of pictures and they break. Now, how do we get the fuel here from here? This is a weird one. I said everybody else puts their valve going into the, you would expect you've got a feed here and you've got a valve to control the fuel flow there. AGM did something weird. So this has a lead seal, kind of like a quick light fuel cap. This is the carburetor valve. It just pulls out, and we will take this screen off the bottom so that you can see what's in here. So this is a piece of brass. It's got a little brass screen in the bottom of it. And this is a lot like a Coleman Instant Light, the early version, with what's similar to a generator tip on it. It's got a tiny little hole, and I don't know if you probably won't be able to see this on the camera, but it's got a little tiny wire protruding through it. And if I run my finger across it, it snags just a little bit. What happens is, as I unscrew the valve, that wire retracts. So this is the same thing as a Coleman fuel and air tube. The air enters here through the top, runs down. A little tiny bit of fuel is getting into the bottom of this past that wire when you open the valve. The air rushes in, picks up those droplets, carries it back up through an inner tube. And then you say, well, how does it get out when this is mounted on the side? Well, if you notice, there's a little tiny hole right here. And you've got this groove going all the way around with a little hole in it. And you've got a little hole right here. So, and then this seals around the outside and in the middle. So what's happening is the fuel and air mixture runs up the inner tube inside here. There's a channel inside, and it comes out this little hole, comes into this channel, feeds into that little hole, and then it feeds up to this little nipple here that goes into our thingamajig, our generator feed. I can't really call it a valve because it's not a valve. It doesn't control anything. Now, my question was, in fact, when I was first experimenting with this, I thought, okay, so that looks like this is how our fuel gets in, and sure enough, I took some carburetor cleaner and the little tube and sprayed it in here, and it came out here. So this channel is clear. So let me show you the patent drawing here, and you can see that there's a sort of a U-shaped tube that runs from where the valve screws in up to where that nipple is in the Fount bung. That's how the fuel gets up there. I'm not sure why they felt the need to design it this way. It just seems overly complicated. If you watch my Akron 132 video, you'll see me run through the engineering drawings or patent drawings on that, and that also seems overly complicated. I can kind of see why Coleman eventually won out. Their design may not have worked the best, but it worked just fine, and it was not nearly this complicated. And certainly I expect it was much cheaper to make. So my guess would be, I expect that all of this stuff in the Fount, the threaded bung up here, the valve seat, and all of that would have been mounted inside the Fount before the bottom was crimped in place and soldered in. So let's look at our valve here. It's got a little tiny tip on the end. It is similar to a gas tip on a generator, although the orifice is significantly larger. And now you can see the needle here. This is basically their answer to Coleman's air stem. Now, do here, I think I'm going to have to, just going to put this in my big channel locks here to hold it. And we'll unscrew the valve stem. Maybe some graphite packing in there. Yep, that's some graphite. That's used to that's used to seal the valve. So that's the outer part of the carburetor valve, and here we've got the innards. There is I don't know if you'll be able to see it. There's a little wire clip on here to hold everything in place, and then inside of this part, inside of the jam nut, we'll have a couple of brass cylinders, and then wedged between them or sandwiched between them is our graphite packing that seals this whole valve. And I don't think, that doesn't seem to want to come out, so I'm not going to break that trying to get it out. And I think the knob is press fit on. I can see it's knurled here and pressed on, but I suspect if I pulled it off, I probably would break something. So I'm going to leave this as it is for now. We've got a fuel cap. It's larger than a Coleman, but it is a three-piece fuel cap like a Coleman, and I've already checked, and this gasket does seal with quite a bit of pressure. In fact, I can see most of the paint has gone from this cap because people have put a wrench on here at various points in time. But I believe this insert and the gasket seem to be the same size as a Coleman. We've just got a larger outside diameter here. And then we've got our pump. That comes out. Grab a paper towel to set this on. We'll come back to that. It's got a check valve, much like a Coleman. The Coleman check valve tool will not fit this guy, so I'm using a large screwdriver. AGM check valves usually come out a lot more easily than Coleman's do. So there's our check valve, and you can hear it rattling in there, and I already know that it works. And there's our fount, and for the rest of this, a nut on the end here. Oh, it's unscrewing at this end. Okay. And we've got our cap and our spring, and just grab onto this. There we go. Got an outer nut. And there's a little, parts are all gummed up, but there's a little washer in there. This is actually a typical AGM design. It's like a wavy washer. And then on the back side, we've got a little brass spacer that keeps the leather centered. We've got a washer on the back side. And another nut that holds everything together. And on some of these, this tip unscrews. I don't think it does on this. I don't see any way to do that. Maybe when we get it degreased. There's nothing to unscrew here. So, so this is our pump assembly. You'll notice, like a Coleman, it's got a hole in the end. The way this works, because it doesn't have a separate air stem, the air's fed in through this little hole down here, which is on the bottom side of all these other parts. So there we go. I'll get these parts cleaned up. The Mica chimney will go into a pot of citric acid. In fact, it will be the very first thing that goes into the citric acid, because clean citric acid that hasn't been contaminated yet is awesome for cleaning mica, and it will clean up this brass. I'll clean the vent with some soap and water, although I've already done a bit of that. These other parts will all go into a citric acid bath, and that will remove any rust, crud, whatever, and prep them for polishing. And the fount, we've got pinholes through here, so I need to Caswell this, at least this side, if not the whole top of the fount. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the paint and then soak it in citric acid, because I want to make sure the inside is clean and de-rusted. And after that, we will do another dunk test, just to make sure that doing all of that didn't result in more pinholes. So the next thing I'm going to do with this, I'm going to try using paint stripper. I've been using wire wheels lately on my drill press, and they work pretty well, and I have a feeling it would take this paint off pretty easily, but I don't want to get very aggressive with this area here, lest messing with the metal and being aggressive open up more pinholes. I don't want it to get any worse than it already is. So we'll jump over to that now. Welcome to my kitchen. I've got the Mica chimney stewing away in some citric acid here. That will clean up the brass and the mica, and I'll rub the brass down with some steel wool, rinse everything well with water, and then bake it in the oven to get all the moisture out. It should take about 20 minutes. And then the citric acid solution, it's about a teaspoon of citric acid powder per liter. I can reuse it, and I can put the fount in when this is done, and then I can put all the other parts in when the fount is done. So you can reuse the citric acid. Okay, here's our Mica chimney out of the citric acid. You can see it's all cleaned up. The brass is starting to brighten up, so I'm just going to rinse it and use some 4/0 steel wool. The nice thing with this AGM design is it uses single sheets instead of overlapping ones like Coleman did, so that makes it a lot easier to clean and dry. Alright, I will pat this dry and then put it in the oven at 350 degrees until it's dry. Let's see how this is doing here. It's been sitting for about 25 minutes, and I think that paint stripper has done what it's supposed to do. It's getting hard to find good paint stripper, and this is about the last of the good stuff I have. So I think it's time to take this in the house and clean it off, and we should be ready to put this in citric acid. And here we are with the fount. The Mica chimney came out, the fount went in, and when this comes out we can put the other parts in. So I'll leave this in here for about 30 minutes. I have now stripped the fount of its paint. It's soaked in citric acid for cleaning and derusting, and I've done some light sanding on the outside to prep it for paint work. So originally, you remember, I said there was a cluster of pinholes here, so I suspect it was sitting upside down at some point and either had water or water in the gasoline, and it rusted from the inside out. So this is going to need a Caswell gas tank sealant treatment. The whole fount doesn't need it, just hopefully just this area or just the top part. On these, this is a steel fount, so I'm not worried about stress cracks. Everything else was sound. And in fact, with the Caswell sealant, I really don't want to treat the bottom because I know people who have done that, and then even though it's a thin layer, they couldn't get the valve back in because it would bottom out on the Caswell. So all I want to do now is just make sure I haven't made the problem worse through any of the treatment. And so I've done some temporary reassembly here. Let's just go ahead and take this whole thing out. Maybe we can check the check valve. And you can see where our pinholes are. They're all here. The check valve is not leaking. That's good. Our valve is not leaking. Fuel cap is not leaking. Let's see. Oh, just a little burp from the tube there. So our problem is still just right in this area here, and that's good. No other bubbles on this side. And I think we probably already lost our pressure there. I'm going to put the pump back in one more time and check the bottom. Bottom's good. Everything's coming out in this area here. Can't see any other bubbles. You can see how quickly that loses pressure. All right, and here's the rest of our lantern soup.
Got the brass parts on the left, steel parts on the right. Again, this is the same citric acid. I've just divided it between 2 pots. It's being used with the chimney and the fount, and now all these other smaller parts. I'll leave them in here for about 20, maybe 30 minutes. Nothing's in particularly nasty shape, so it shouldn't take too long. So as parts come out of the citric acid bath, I'm going to rinse them with some cold water, rub them down with steel wool, 4/0 steel wool, and I've got a brass brush if anything needs some scrubbing. Polishing should help that look. Let's polish up some of these parts. Some I'm just going to be more careful with. I don't trust myself with this in the polishing wheel. If it gets thrown across the room, it doesn't happen very often, but if it does, I'll be really sad. So I might do some polishing by hand, but most of the other things should be okay. I'm using a firm cotton buffing wheel and some white polishing compound. All right, let's seal this fount. Again, the area we want to seal is basically this area here, just up beyond the mark made by the collar, and we've got a pinhole here, so basically just above the pump tube. Everything else is fine. If I get it in other places, that's fine too. So to prep the fount, I've rinsed it with acetone and made sure it's clean and dry. You want to keep the pump installed because just in case Caswell's gets into the pump snorkel, people often don't realize the pump tube goes down and there's more than just a check valve at the bottom. That doesn't just open straight into the fount where it would be going into a bunch of gasoline. On the back of the check valve, there's a snorkel that goes up and delivers the air right to the very top of the fount. And that's a safety thing, so gas can't come back through the check valve. But I'm particularly concerned about that in this case. Even though the snorkel should be over on this side and I'm sealing this side, I'm going to be getting sealant or epoxy on the top of the fount inside, and it could drip down and foul that snorkel. And if that happens, it's very, very difficult to deal with. The stuff is not easily removed. What I've got is the pump installed so that I can keep pumping air through it until the epoxy sets and I'm no longer worried about it dripping down into the snorkel. Because I'm going to be repainting the fount, I'm not worried about if Caswell sealant gets on there. I have protected the threads. I'm not too worried about these threads. I don't think I'll have a problem getting sealant on that over on that side. And of course the bung isn't an issue because this is a sealed thing. And actually if I get some Caswell around the base of that, all the better. It makes sure it's sealed. So that's good. Normally I would be doing something about protecting the threads in the bung, but I don't have to worry about it this time. So since I've just got a small area to do, I'm not going to do the whole fount. Again, if you do the whole fount, I've talked to and read multiple stories of people with these AGM founts where they Caswelled the bottom because they usually have stress cracks, and the sealant pooled on the bottom and wouldn't allow the carburetor valve to seat fully. It blocked the bottom. So since the rest of this is fine, I just want to seal this part. So I'm going to mix up about 30 milliliters of this Caswell sealant. 1 part of this. So I like to take one of these little cups. 10 milliliters is kind of just up to this first lip here. And I use these, they call them craft sticks, I call them tongue depressors, whatever. Someone in my video on this, which there's a link above, or there was, said I should just use a spoon. I've actually found the tongue depressors work just fine. But this allows me to meter out a precise amount. Caswell says one of the biggest failures is when people don't mix it at the right ratio. So it's not, don't think it has to be exact, but it needs to be pretty close to exact. So that's good there. And we'll mix, this is the thick part. This is where the craft stick is ideal. Do not use the same stick. If you mix these in the little cans, you will end up with some even stickier product in the end the next time you open it up. And there's my mark. Okay. Now, their other biggest failure, they say, is when people fail to thoroughly mix the product. So we're going to make sure this is well mixed. They say 2 minutes, but I don't think we need to do a full 2 minutes when it's just this little bit. That would be if you're mixing the whole thing. You could make a little paper, or maybe out of some thin plastic or vinyl or something, you could make a little funnel that fits in here and tape it in place. I've seen that done. I could probably, if I was really careful, pour this in, but again, I don't want to pour it into the bottom of the fount. I want to hold the fount more or less upside down and pour it into the top, and that's not going to work. So what I like to do when I'm working with this stuff is I've got one of these 60 milliliter syringes. I will tape off the bottom just to make sure it doesn't leak on me while I'm filling it. And I will pour this into the syringe. And then with the syringe, I can easily direct it where I want it, relatively easily. If you clean the acetone out, or if you clean out the epoxy with a bit of acetone afterward, you can reuse the syringe. Not quite 30 milliliters, but this should be, as you can see, I just need to coat the inside, so this should be fine. Yeah, so let's put this guy in place. This is going to want to start to leak as soon as I take this off. So again, I'm putting it in here. I want it to go over here. So it's thick. I can feel it all over here. So make sure the pump tube is clear. Don't seem to have anything on there. Just going to go ahead and you can think about it. You can feel the weight shifting around a little bit inside there. And I think we're good. So I'm going to grab a flashlight here and make sure our threads there are clean. And we're good here. If I look down inside, I can see where it has gone to some extent. So at this point, I'm just going to let it sit like that and let it start to set. And one of the things you can check is, because I've left a little bit in the cup, we can kind of observe what's happening with this and with our tongue depressor, and that'll tell us when this stuff is starting to set up. The Fount passes a dunk test and it is ready for priming. I've wiped it down with acetone to remove any grease, and I'm going to use some just basic trim clad gray primer on this. I've got the fuel cap and the pump cap on because they need to be painted along with the Fount. Right, I'll let that set for about 10 minutes and then do another coat. Our last step before the final coat of paint, I'm going to wet sand this with some 1000 grit sandpaper, basically just getting the primer so it's nice and smooth. Just sanding very lightly and run my fingers over it to see how it feels. If I run my fingers here, I can feel drag, and as I sand, it gets much smoother. So I just keep sanding until everything's nice and smooth.
slightly damp hands. Just going to run over everything just to see how it feels. And when it's smooth, it's ready for that final coat of paint. So just clean all of this off now. Let it dry and we'll be good to go. All right, let's spray our color coat. For this, I'm using some Duplicolor Perfect Match. This is automotive paint, and this is Indigo Blue Pearl, which is, at least going by the cap, this is the closest I can find to what was on this. It was kind of pearlescent, so I'm hoping that's a good match. So I've shaken the can. Let's get started. All right, coat number 2. And our final coat. Let's start putting this back together. You'll remember the carburetor valve I've already reassembled because I needed that in order to confirm that the fount was sealed after putting in the epoxy. So I'm just going to put that back in. Should be good. And I've already replaced the cap gasket. I was getting tired of having to cinch this down with pliers and not scratch it. So I've already gone ahead and replaced that since I needed it for the testing. I'll throw up a link above to my video on replacing cap gaskets if you're interested. And our pump, you'll remember the check valve is already in there. So we'll put all of this back together. So, these nuts on. And then this backer. And we put this little brass cylinder on to center it. Make sure that that's good and tight because, oops. If it's not, all that can fall off down in the bottom of the pump too. And now for the other end, put the spring on cap and the handle. And I've been using this. It's got some oil in there. The cup's pretty flexible, but let's make sure it's well oiled. And there we go. Now let's make sure everything's working. So and we should have air hissing out. And we do. So that's wonderful. We don't have air hissing out through any holes over here. Okay, now we need to start putting the uppers together. I've been pretty conservative polishing this guy just because there's just this brass tube that's brazed in these two spots that hold the two halves of this together, and I really don't want to break this. So proper clocking, I'm assuming, because all of the photos I can find of AGM 287s and 288s have the valve knob sticking out in between these two, roughly over the valve stem, or the pump stem rather. So that means I want this oriented like this. And I've already test fit it, and it's not super tight at that point. So I'm going to go ahead and put a healthy bit of thread sealant on there, and that will make sure it doesn't leak, and it will tighten it up once it hardens. Oops. And I'm turning by this part, not by this part. And that's pretty much as tight as it's going to get. And I just want to make sure there's no sealant clogging that up. So let's test it again. All right, wonderful. Always good to check those things before the sealant sets. It's a lot easier to deal with it now. So now, I don't know why I kept saying the valve knob is in between, because the valve knob's over here. But anyways, the orientation for this guy goes in the back. If there was a valve stem, it would be sticking out here. So we will put our collar on, and the center hole here is for the generator holder. I don't know what else to call this thing. And this hole back here is where the air tube goes in, and this little nub here goes in this guy, and that kind of holds everything together like that. So we've got two screws here, and we've got this nut here. I don't want to tighten that until these two screws are in. Our little nub is sticking up, so that means this won't turn, but we need to lock it down to the bottom part. And I don't know if someone maybe over tightened this at some point, but I noticed I didn't want to over tighten them and tear them out. But when I was tightening, or when I put them in originally, because if you remember, they were just kicking loose inside the cage or the chimney. When I put them in and went to tighten them, it felt like any second now it might strip out. So I'm going to help myself out here with some thread sealant. There we go. And this other one. Boy, these are not easy to line up. I didn't have that much trouble before. Okay, so now I can just snug these up. Actually, before I do that, I feel like this is leaning. So let's make sure everything's straight under here. And actually what's leaning, the lean is in the cage. And I don't know if you can tell, maybe this was made at 4:30 on a Friday, but it's these two that are leaning this way a bit, and they're not bent. If I look at the bottom, they're slightly off kilter. So now we can tighten this nut. And we don't have to worry about anything getting bent underneath. Okay, now everything's solid. So let's put together our burner assembly. So this guy screws in down here. And this guy screws on there, and then we've got our burner caps. This one, the coupler didn't want to come out, so I just left it in there. Oh, and yeah, this one we've got, because the coupler's still in there, we've got our burner screen still in place. But this guy, we need to put our burner screens back in place. And they just all right, there we've got one in, and we should be able to drop the other in on top of it. Why they have two, I don't know, but that's not the only lantern I've seen that does that. And then we've got our coupler. Okay, and we'll put this guy back in, even though we took him out and it didn't do us any good because we couldn't get this apart. And now we're ready to just screw this guy in. Make sure everything's lined up. There we go. There. Now for our generator, I'm going to put this in, and normally I'm kind of OCD about this and I want it straight on, but I'm actually going to mount this to the side so that I can get in there more easily with, if I need to rotate the cleaning lever, so that I can open the door in the chimney and get to it. Whereas if it's in front of this upright, that makes it rather difficult. Okay. All right. So let's tie on a couple of mantles. These take number 21s, or I'm putting on a couple of Peerless 2CHGs, which are equivalent. And I don't know what the AGM mantle would have been, although it would have been of comparable size. Okay, make sure everything's spread around relatively evenly. All right. Put our chimney in. Get that brass cleaned up pretty nicely. And we will put our vent on. And there we go. So through the magic of video editing, I'll be back momentarily, and this will be gassed up, pumped up, and we'll be ready to burn those mantles in. All right, I'm back. It's gassed up. I've pumped it up with about 30 strokes, so we just need to burn in the mantles. Nobody makes good matches anymore. And I think we're about good there. So I'm going to turn this. Before I stick the match in there, let's open the valve and see if we can hear it hissing and gurgling. Okay, that's a good sign. The matches, on the other hand, not having much luck with these matches. Okay, let's try this again. And I think we need to just a tip cleaner a bit. It's trying.
Eternity later.
Well, after a great deal of fussing, I've got this thing running pretty darn well. It's got a bit of a pulse to it that comes and goes. That seems to often be the curse of double mantle lanterns. I don't know why that is. Not all of them do it. My Coleman L220 doesn't. My L228 doesn't. My Akron doubles don't, but most of my 220s do. And
This guy does a little bit. Again, it comes and goes. Not really sure why. But the main problem that you saw when I was trying to light it was barely getting enough gasoline to light. The mantle on the right would light up and just glow. It was very dim, and the mantle on the left would keep going out. So I thought maybe it was a bad generator, even though I'd cleaned the generator and it was passing fuel well, and the tip seemed to be clean. So I've tried 3 different R55s, and they all do exactly the same thing, which is weird. I've asked around, and most people seem to run Coleman R55s in these with no trouble. I tried to do research on the original AGM generator that would have come with it, and what, say, for example, the gas tip, what size the orifice was, and I can't find any of that information. But most double mantle lanterns that are gasoline use a gas tip with a 0.008 inch orifice in it. That's what the R55 has, Q99, the 220 generators, the later AGM generators for their double mantle gasoline lanterns. They're all 0.008 inches. So I put this R55 into a Coleman 327, worked just fine. So it's something with this lantern. I'm stumped. It's getting plenty of fuel. If I take the generator out, the amount of fuel coming out of the valve is not an issue. The generator works fine in another lantern. I've checked everything in the manifold. I mean, you saw everything came apart. The only thing we didn't get apart was where the air tube goes into the main manifold body. But because the top of the manifold comes off, we're able to get that thoroughly cleaned. So everything seemed fine. I can't figure out the underfueling problem. So I decided that I would try increasing the orifice on the gas tip. So I dug out a 236 generator, a Coleman. It has a 0.0095 orifice in it, so just a little bit bigger. Put that on this R55, the same one, and it runs just fine in terms of brightness. So I don't know why an R55 with a 0.008 gas jet works fine for everyone else and not for me. It doesn't make any sense. Especially when the air supply system and the manifold and all that are clean and all of that. But that solved the fuel problem. The other problem I was having, even after it was running brightly, at that point with a proper fueling, both mantles were running reasonably brightly, but the left was dimmer than the right. And that kind of had me stumped. So at that point, I unscrewed the top of the manifold, that mixing chamber, and was able to look down with a light underneath and look down through both burner caps. And I noticed the burner cap on this side is the one that I was able to get them both off, but there's that little coupler that's threaded on both ends that holds the burner cap to the manifold. The one on the right, I couldn't get that little coupling tube out, and I didn't want to bend it trying to force it. On the left side, that coupler was very loose, so I was able to remove it. I took out the burner screens, and you may have noticed when I was putting it back together, there were 2 burner screens in each side. And what I noticed when I looked down with a bright light underneath and looked down through the burner caps is on this side, the 2 screens line up very, very closely. In fact, it's almost hard to tell that there are 2 layers of mesh because they line up almost perfectly. The other side, they were at one was at a 45-degree angle to the other, so it was kind of like this instead of like that or like that. And that seemed to be restricting the flow of the fuel and air mixture down into the mantle. So I took the burner cap off, and I thought, what happens if I just take one of the screens out? Oh, all of a sudden the left side was brighter than the right side, but it went from just a mild pulsing like a lot of double mantle lanterns do to just the left side was pulsing like crazy. So that tells me why they put two screens in there. The 2 screens help regulate the pressure of that gas coming out. So I took it apart again,
more mantles down the tubes. I normally don't have problems like this, but I put the screen back in, and what I noticed is when it's difficult to get the screens lined up one on top of the other in there, but you can get them lined up, and then when you screw that little coupler tube in and it hits the top screen, it wants to turn it. So I was trying to come up with ways of sticking some bent wire up through a couple of the holes in the mesh to try to hold them together when I got it screwed in. And it's not perfect. They are lined up really nicely like this, but they're slightly off inside there. So as opposed to being directly on top of each other, it's a little bit like that. So it is restricting the flow on the outside edge. And the left mantle is marginally less bright than the right side. You probably won't be able to see that on the camera, but I'm going to leave it as it is. The other thing I did try, again, more mantles wasted. I have this burner cap from an older AGM American Ready Light lantern. It's got the same style Ready Light burner. It's just the pre-pump, it uses even the same generator and everything, and it's missing everything, the vent, the globe, the burner cage, all of that. But I've got the Fount, and it was running an R55 as well, and it's got the manifold and all of that. And interestingly enough, it runs fine with an R55, unlike this guy. So I don't know what this guy's issue is with that, but the gas increasing the size of the orifice has fixed that. But it's the burner caps on that guy are different. They have a single screen, but they've got this star pattern in the bottom, which seems to be their older way of regulating the flow. I did swap out both these burner caps with these. It didn't do anything with the pulsing. It didn't make it any brighter, but it definitely evened everything out. I was tempted to leave these on, but I really do want to get that Ready Light running at some point. I don't want to part it out. So I've put the original burner caps back on this. And I'm just going to live with it with a little bit of uneven brightness on that left mantle. So I'm happy to hear comments if you know more about these. I've kind of asked in the AGM group on Facebook and not really getting any information. Most people don't have any problems with these 287s, 288s. They just run. And that's not been my experience, but I still like this lantern. It's beautiful. And it's running well enough now. In fact, with that larger gas tip, it's nice and bright. So I'm sorry you missed the initial successful light up, but it is running properly now, and we will light it up. So we'll just open this door. I like this brass mica cage. Turn that for you while it's running. It looks like we may need to clean the generator. There we go. Oh. So I don't know if you can see or not, the mantle on the left isn't quite as bright, and that's because I think on one side the mesh or the screen has slightly smaller openings on this outside side than on the inside. But trying to get those things lined up while screwing in the coupler tightly is just a major headache, and I think this is as good as it's going to get right now, unless someone's got a trick for dealing with that. So you can see it's just got a little bit of a pulse. It kind of comes and goes. But let's turn off the lights. So here she is in the dark. pulsing a little bit, pretending she's a Coleman 220, I guess. But I'd say she's about as bright as a quick light, or probably most of my 220s. Other than the pulsing running pretty well, so at some point I may try to resolve this further, but at this point I'm going to call this one a success. We went from a lantern that had pinholes and leaked fuel everywhere and had a clogged carburetor valve to a lantern that is now running and looks pretty darn gorgeous, I think. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.